This episode is presented by Brex, the financial stack founders can bank on. Learn more at brex.com/techcrunch24.
Hello, you're listening to Found, TechCrunch's podcast that brings you the stories behind the startups. I'm Becca Skutak, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host,
Dominic Midori Davis.
And today, we're not actually bringing you a founder story. We're here to tell you that this will sadly be the last episode of Found. I personally have been on Found for a little over 2 years and have really enjoyed talking to different founders, everything from companies trying to bring the woolly mammoth back to life to big companies everyone knows like Klarna and Brex, and just sort of everything in between.
And of course, a lot of AI. Lots of AI.
So much AI. We were talking to AI companies before you were talking about AI companies.
Yeah.
Not to flex.
Not to flex. We were a little bit ahead there. But don't worry, TC podcasts still live on in equity and the Strictly BC download. So we're still around technically, kind of.
Yeah. And you can always access our old episodes if you want to get great context. If there's a big news announcement from one of the companies we've had on the show, I would say our show is actually a perfect place to go listen to kind of get a little bit more of the human interest side of the founders behind that company. Give yourself a little context. That will always be available, even if we're no longer bringing you new content.
To wrap it up, we're going to play the very first episode of Found, recorded way back April 21st, 2021, when Daryl Etherington and Jordan Crook spoke to Aman Abuzed from Incredible Health. Thank you for listening to us over the years. Bye.
Oh, thank you. Bye.
This episode is presented by Brex, the financial stack founders can bank on. Brex knows cash is king for startups, so they built a banking experience that takes every dollar further. Unlike traditional business banking solutions, Brex has no minimums and no transaction fees, and you can get 20 times the standard FDIC protection. Even better, you can earn industry-leading yields from your first dollar while still being able to access your funds anytime. Get the business account trusted by 1 in 3 U.S. startups at brex.com/techcrunch24.
Hey, I'm Daryl Etherington, and I'm here with my co-host and best buddy,
Jordan Crook, aka Daryl's best friend.
We've got a brand new show for you from TechCrunch. This is Found, and it's a podcast all about founders. So every week we host a different founder, and they tell us all about the challenges, the highs, the lows, the excitement of building their own company, including stuff like raising money from VCs, figuring out when to pivot, and making the toughest decisions that you have to make, like shutting down entire product lines. Jordan, what did you think about these conversations that we've been having with founders so far?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking to founders for the last 10 years, writing for TechCrunch. I think what's cool is finally a lot of those conversations are going to get to translate and our audience is going to hear them instead of the 10% that they usually get on a podcast. They're very honest, a lot of candor, and it's been really interesting and rewarding for me.
So without further ado, let's get into the show. Our first guest is Aman Abuzed. She is the founder of Incredible Health, which is a platform for hiring medical professionals and specifically nurses in the U.S. We had a chat with Aman all about, why was this thing even needed to begin with? How did she set about creating it? How did her background, she's a medical doctor, influence her building of the business? And, how has kind of the past year, and particularly the COVID-19 pandemic, affected the trajectory of her startup? Jordan, what did you think about our conversation with Aman?
I felt like I learned a lot. Like I think you feel like you get an idea of what's going on in the healthcare industry, especially in the last year where there's so much talk about it. But I mean, the fact that there's such a shortage of nurses blew my mind, and kind of the rigmarole that they have to go through to get a new job and how that churn and turnover affects the entire industry was eye-opening to me.
Yeah, for sure. And Aman is really focused on kind of the entire career experience of nurses and, ensuring that they have positive experiences and are supported throughout. And she also takes this very sort of procedural, diligent approach as a founder, and that'll come across, you'll hear from her in the conversation we have. All right, so let's go ahead and get into our chat with Aman, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Iman, it's so great to have you here. This is a brand new show for us, and we're really excited for you to be one of the first guests. I think we could just get right into it. And if you could tell us a bit about sort of how you started Incredible Health and why you did, and kind of, what that process was like for you.
So the year is 2017. And
Ooh, really setting the stage. I like this.
Oh my God, that feels so good though. Say that again. The year is 2017.
the year is 2017. And so at this point, by background, I'm an MD, and a lot of my family members and friends are doctors and surgeons, and they were often complaining about understaffing. At the same time, my co-founder and CTO, Rome Portlock, who's a software engineer, went to MIT, all of that stuff, his siblings, a lot of his family members are nurses. And they were saying, even though I'm experienced and I'm qualified, and it still takes me at least 2-3 months to get my next job, right? Like, I apply to 10, 15 places, I usually never hear back. If I hear back, it takes months. And we're like, okay, this doesn't make any sense, right? Because the US has a huge shortage of healthcare workers, nurses and others, right? And
yeah, it's so in demand. You'd think you could just walk up to a hospital and be like, here's the paperwork, let me in.
Exactly. Right? But what we discovered is it's not at all easy. And, it's the processes, the tools, the technology is completely outdated, hasn't changed since the early 90s, which is crazy because healthcare is the biggest labor sector in the US today by number of workers. And it's also the labor sector that suffers from the biggest shortages too. To put it in context, the nursing shortage is 3 times bigger than the software engineering shortage.
Wow. That's, for us especially, like Jordan and I, we hear about that all the time. And because engineers are like oil, right, for most tech companies. And it's like so valuable, so hard to come by, so expensive. So that really does put it in context, I think. Like that's wild.
Yeah, so we figure there just has to be a better way. Like there has to be a better way for these two parties to meet. And so
to put it in infomercial terms.
Yeah, I know, right? I was about to be like, there's gotta be a better
exactly. And so, we built this career marketplace for healthcare workers called Incredible Health. And what that means is hospitals and health systems use our software to hire nurses in permanent roles in 20 days or less. And it is now the fastest growing venture-backed career marketplace for healthcare workers in the US today. And there's 3 key things we did. Like, the first is that the employers apply to the talent instead of the other way around. The second thing we did is we've automated a lot of the screening of the talent through lots of integrations with other databases. And so we're able to serve up very high quality talent at all times. And the third thing is we built these custom matching algorithms. So it's a very personalized experience for both sides of the platform. And really, it's just the results of that has been hiring happens in 20 days or less. I think during the pandemic, it accelerated to 12 days or less. It normally takes 80, 90 days to fill a permanent experienced nurse position.
So you talked about the different things you did to kind of make that easier, but how did you identify those as the problem points to begin with? Was it mostly your personal experience, or was it just, you mentioned that you had, your co-founder had siblings, so obviously you're talking to a lot of folks in the industry.
Yeah, we did go through a pretty robust ideation process in order to identify these problems, had a really strong understanding of the market. I honestly would call up friends on Wall Street. I went to Wharton for business school, so I have friends on Wall Street. So I'd call them up and ask them for their market research reports on this industry. So really had a great understanding of the market. And then certainly talking to customers, right? So whether it's nurses or hospital executives, and trying to understand their challenges. Now, for the hospital executives, it was really interesting, right? Because they run businesses that are very low margin. Hospitals are usually low margin businesses. And when you're understaffed and you don't have enough healthcare workers or clinicians, you're effectively spending on overtime or on contract workers. Overtime usually costs at least 1.5 times more than a regular permanent worker. And a contract worker costs 2x. And during the pandemic, it actually costs 3x, 4x more than a regular permanent worker. And so they're under a lot of pressure to really get these costs down. And they're also responsible for driving high quality care, right? So when you're understaffed, your quality of care goes down.
So you had the double threat of having that business background and then also being an MD.
Can we
it seems
talk
like
about
you're
your
uniquely
timeline?
able to do it, right? And yeah, let's talk
like
about that
what?
too.
How did like you are a doctor who went to Wharton Business School? Like what? Okay, overachiever, but like what order did you do those things in?
Yeah, so I went to medical school first, decided not to do residency when I finished med school. Went into management consulting first, actually. I worked at Booz Allen, at McKinsey, doing hospital operations and strategy, did that for a couple years, and then did my MBA at Wharton, then moved to the Bay Area. So I moved to the Bay Area, 7 years ago. And that's really when I got into into technology and software and startups. So I joined as like an early employee at an early stage healthcare technology company. That's really where I learned to work with engineers and designers and data scientists and so on. I led product there. And that's where I grew a lot of those skills. Did that for a few years before deciding to found Incredible Health.
So you're just proving me right, essentially.
Yeah. So you've achieved far too much. Yeah, I know. Me and Jordan are both sitting here doing the math, and we're like, what did we get done in that span of time?
Come on, you guys are like badass reporters at TechCrunch, right?
That's why we brought it up. We wanted you to just read us some compliments. Thank you. I feel better now. I'm go kiss my diploma.
When you moved to San Francisco, you didn't have it in your head at that time to do the startup thing, or what was the thinking there, I guess?
Actually starting a company, like a high growth company, was something I've wanted to do actually for a long time, like probably since my time in medical school. But like the thing with a goal like that, and sorry, the reason I had that goal is like both my grandfathers were entrepreneurs, and I just have this belief, and it's an opinion, right, that the epitome of what you can do with a career in business is to start your own company. And that's just like a value that I had in my head. But the path to get there is not like that straightforward, right? Because I believe there's a certain set of skills that are really helpful that I wanted to collect, right, before founding my own company. And there's a certain network or number of people or specific types of people that I wanted to meet before starting a company. For example, software engineers, right? My co-founder, Rome, starting a company with a technical co-founder that's a software company is a lot easier, right? So, yeah.
Yes. How did you connect up with Rome there?
We actually worked as employees at that early stage healthcare technology company. So he's an engineering lead and I was a product lead.
What did you like when you were working there? I feel like that is like the clear lead up to you going and founding your own company. I don't need to know what company it is, although I'm sure it's Googleable. What did you say, like, okay, these are the pieces I'm going to keep, and these are the pieces I'm definitely going to do differently, right?
Yeah.
When I launch my own company.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of that, actually. So the key skills that I kept is like how to build product, how to work with a team to build a product in healthcare, right? Because when it comes to software products in healthcare, it's just, you have to be at least 10x differentiated. Like whatever you create has to be at least 10x better than what's already out there, because that's the only way you can really cut through the noise and regulation and restrictions and all the headache that is the healthcare industry, right? You have to come up with something really good. So that's a huge takeaway that I got from that. And then the other thing is I learned a lot about what to do and what not to do when you're constructing your board and your investors, and how thoughtful and careful you need to be about which investors you involve and who joins your board. Because I saw it done well, I also saw it not done so well, and there were a lot of lessons learned there. Like, okay, when I start my own company, I'm going to try to avoid those errors and those mistakes.
Those are lessons I think you have to, it seems like most people learn them the hard way, right? By firsthand experience, but it's nice that you were able to kind of like observe it. But yeah, Jordan, what were you asking there?
I just wanted to know, like, what were they? Because we have founders are listening to this podcast called Found. You said you noticed like errors in how people build a board, or like how they identify the right investors and like who to take money from. Like, it's a question that fascinates me because you get in such a like short-term mindset sometimes when starting a company, right? Like you just have to get through the day. Like I just have to get through this week. I just like have to get the check because we're running out of runway or whatever. And you like stop thinking about the fact that these relationships last like 7, 10, 12 years, right? Like it's the person you're going to have to answer the phone for regularly. And so I'm just curious, like how you, from learning at that first company, like how did you what kind of criteria did you use to choose investors?
Yeah,
right. Like,
yeah, absolutely. So there was a lot of learnings, several different criteria that matters a lot. One is making sure that the investor is the right fit for you, personality wise, as well as a fit for the company, right? So I tend to gear towards investors that are very high integrity. I prefer former operators. Certainly, we're running a marketplace business, so love marketplace experience. And honestly, I have a very strong bias for investors in the Bay Area, because investors in the Bay Area are they have quite a lot of experience in internet and software companies, 20 plus years in some cases, and they're very risk taking when it comes to investors who are compared to investors who are not in the Bay Area. So that's just like my opinion, bias, right?
That's interesting, because you don't think about the risk aversion factor. Because I think people think that it's like an element of concentration, or like the other things you mentioned. I think those have come up to mind a lot more. Like people have more experience in software if they're in their area, but the risk appetite is a big factor. And I think you're right. Like it seems like, yes, like people in the valley are much less risk averse than people outside of it, just because they're so frequently exposed to it and they've seen so many cycles. Right?
That's one of the first times I've heard it stated so plainly too, right? Because you always, the common thing that you always hear about Silicon Valley is like, oh, you could take 20 meetings in a day because they're literally all on Sand Hill Road. And that makes sense. And that's why I would move my business out there, because there's just so many of them. They're all right in the same place. But it does make a lot of sense that they'd be less risk averse than other geographically located VCs.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what about the actual process?
Yeah, and so then
of fundraising.
So the process. So one other thing is, like, I'm really big on references when it comes to investors, and the only references that truly matter are the other founders and CEOs, right? Like that's it. And so if those references are not very, very strong, then you probably shouldn't go with that investor, right? So.
That's another good point, and another sort of basic fundamental thing that probably a lot of people get wrong. But it's like, no, you can ask anybody you want. Those are the people that matter. You can ask me and Jordan. We probably think tons of investors are great people to talk to. They might be terrible investors. We don't know.
Right. Well, in terms of maybe not the investments they make, but how they, manage their portfolio companies and how they advise them.
Exactly. And how they interact with the founders and so on. Yeah.
Well, and it's the same thing too, is when you first meet someone and you're like, oh, you're great. Cause you're in the dating period, and then you're like, oh, actually you're toxic. It's different once the paperwork's signed, and it's hard to know that unless you have references.
Yeah. And you're right, Jordan, you have to take a long-term vision on this. You're with them for 10 years. So you better make sure that they're the right people for you.
Don't you think it's problematic how often that analogy comes up, the dating analogy? But I guess it just seems so appropriate. But we hear it a lot, Jordan. And it's there's no other relationship that it really compares quite as much to, because of the duration of it, and well,
and also the financial, you are financially bound.
Yes, that's right. You're linked up.
You could have your best friend in the world, but you don't share a checking account. Not that you share a checking account with an investor, but you literally your personal and professional finances are tied up with another human being. The only time that really ever happens is in marriage, right? So I think that analogy isn't just about longevity. It's about tying your fate together in a way that's so intense.
Exactly. You can't get rid of your investors. You can get rid of customers. You can get rid of employees. You can get rid of all kinds of people. You cannot get rid of the investors. They're with you.
I wanted to know about, because it's also something we're asked frequently from founders, is just how do I do it? It seems so inscrutable from the outside, right? How does successful funding happen?
Yeah, so I'd raised a seed round of a couple of $1 million in 2017, led by Obvious Ventures, and that was an oversubscribed round when we were fortunate enough to be selective about who we go with. And then raised a $15 million Series A in 2019, which again, I had term sheets from the top 3 VCs in the world and was able to be very selective about who we go with. Ultimately went with Jeff Jordan and Andreessen Horowitz. And, so the thing with fundraising, there's two critical areas that you have to get really right. And that's the content and the process. In terms of process, it starts with selecting who's your target list, right? Back to who's going to be the right fit for you. In our case, two-sided marketplace experience, Bay Area, has done it before, former operator, all that stuff, right? And
good reviews, I
exactly,
assume.
great references, so on, right?
Stellar references.
But the reference stage, you can actually, from a process standpoint, you could potentially punt that to the end, when you're trying to decide. Yeah. And then it's important to like sequence the order of which you're pitching them to, right? So start with your tier 3, the people you don't.
I love that. Yeah, you get some practice in.
Safety schools first.
And end with a tier 1, right? And that's because, it's similar to getting a job, right? Like when you're interviewing for jobs, you go for the companies that you don't really care about that much first, right? And then you have your
maybe you do.
at the end, right?
Jordan just accidentally got a job and has it now.
Literally for 10 years. Oh my God. It never ends, the cycle.
So the reason I like that is like, it's like, you're practicing, right? And you want to be at peak pitch performance by the end, right?
So one of my questions is, because I was talking to Isaac Oates, the JustWorks CEO, just yesterday, and one of the things that he said that I found interesting was like, you build the pitch around you and the brand and what you're building, and like it will attract the right investors. So I'm wondering, when you say like you get your pitch practice in, like, does that mean you're like tweaking the deck and you're tweaking the pitch? Or does that just mean like you've run it enough times to just freaking nail it? Like
you're tweaking. Every meeting is a learning opportunity, even if they say no, right? Like, and it's an opportunity to improve your story, improve your deck, whatever it is, right? And so it's just important to go in with that mindset. Like, you're not just trying to sell. You're trying to also learn and just keep improving that way. And then the next piece is the content, right? So what you're saying matters a ton, right? And this is an area that I had to spend a lot of time just getting better on, right? So when explaining the vision and the market for Incredible Health, it was critical to come across as very ambitious, which is what we are, right? So Incredible Health is a career marketplace for healthcare workers, and we're building the category-defining, market-leading company in healthcare labor, right? That sounds way bigger and way more ambitious than saying like, oh, we're building a two-sided marketplace, we're going to make some money. At the end of the day, especially when it comes to Bay Area investors, like they are looking to build legendary companies, category-defining companies, and so you got to match that level of ambition, and that's probably.
But aren't they just doing that because they like the money that comes out the other side? Or are they actually, like, that's really, you need to put it in their brains. Like, no, this is going to be world changing and you're going to be part of it.
Those two things are highly correlated, right? If you're building, if the company ends up becoming category defining and market leading, the money will come, right? So they're very ambitious, and they have to do because of, the way their financials work, right? So as a founder who's seeking venture capital, you better be equally ambitious.
Right.
Is there like any balance that you have to strike with humility too? Because I've also heard from investors like, yeah, we want to see, don't come to me with a pitch deck if there isn't a B in your TAM slide, right? Obviously. But then I need to know that you could make money on this market right now, and how that could easily turn into, this giant big bubble of the double-digit, triple-digit billion, maybe trillion, and like balance.
Yeah, exactly. So the content of the deck, you're painting a big vision, a big market. What you're doing basically over the next 10 years, right? Then you got to shift to like, okay, what's reality today, right? What's your go-to-market today? Which narrow segments are you starting with? So, for example, and for Incredible Health, like we are starting with nurses and acute care hospitals. By the time I was raising the Series A, we were already serving over 150 hospitals. Now it's over 350 hospitals that we work with today, and highlighting some of the deals basically we've already closed, and you really have to lay out the segmentation very clearly. Like, of course, after nurses, we want to do doctors and physical therapists and pharmacists and so on, right? After acute care hospitals, we want to do surgical centers and urgent care and so on. So that's over the course of 10 years. But like, we're very focused on these markets today and making progress here.
Yeah, I think that's like often a tension, right? And people have a hard time resolving it because you hear all the time, focus, but then you also need that like, but when we get here, we rule the world, right? So it's kind of like people struggle with like, how do we do that? And how much do you weight that? Especially in maybe like a seed stage deck, right? Where a lot of it is, there's nothing really concrete. You're just kind of like, I got to sell you this idea and it's going to be great. So, how did that change, I guess, from your seed to your Series A, and how did you balance the sort of concrete elements and
Yeah, it honestly didn't change that much between the seed and Series A in terms of the traction did, of course, but not the long-term vision. And I think founders should have a very clear idea of what they want to do over the course of 10 years. Because at the end of the day, like that's your guiding light. Like that's the mission of your company, right? Like our vision is to help healthcare professionals live better lives. The mission is to help them find and do their best work. Like that's the ultimate goal, right? And of course, you have to lay out a clear plan for how to get there. But that should be guiding a lot of your decision making.
I was going to ask about specifics around Incredible Health, because I know we're painting it pretty generally right now, but you've told me before, and I find it like super interesting how you define those two things, like where you are now and then your ultimate vision. Like you mentioned, like making life better for healthcare professionals everywhere, but like you have such a big vision of like what that includes, and it's way beyond, I think, like a lot of the stuff you're doing already.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the talent side, early days we were just the place where a nurse finds his or her permanent job, right? And what we really evolved into becoming the place where a nurse manages their career, right? So we now offer things like free continuing education for every single nurse in the country so that they can which they need to stay compliant with their licenses. And they used to pay, $250 million out of pocket is spent by nurses every year on continuing education. And we're like, forget it. Let's give it to them for free, right? And then, free salary estimators. We just launched a social network that's exclusively for nurses so they can give each other advice. This is a group, especially over the last 12 months, that has gone through quite a lot of fatigue and burnout and struggle, right? And they are very supportive of each other. And so we added features to support them with that. And so we're going on this journey of really helping them manage their career over the course of their lifetimes, right? On the employer side, it's not enough to just be like, okay, here's some nurses, right? We've provided like the pandemic hiring suite, which is like, automated interview scheduling and remote interviewing options and lots of features that help them with their workflow software, right? We provide a whole set of data analytics that helps them continue to improve their internal hiring processes because we are able to provide them with their, benchmark competitor data because they're using our platform too, anonymized, of course. And so it's really thinking through like really deeply for both sides of the marketplace, like what are the other additional value add things that we can provide that eventually enable us to own this entire market and deliver at least a 10x improvement on their lives today.
Yeah, it just really illustrates to me how you do that you slice off the narrow thing and you say, this is like the immediate, very painful thing that we're going to go out and fix. And then you're like, but guess what? Like it evolves into this. And then it's not even it's like at first it seems like, well, maybe your risk is you're a single touch point, but it's like, no, we're a continuous touch point on both sides throughout the career cycle. Right. And yeah.
Did it feel like fairly obvious when you were deciding like product iterations and like, okay, we're going to add this, we're going to like build this, and as you kind of like piece the puzzle together, did it feel obvious in what order that should go? Or was that like a thing that took a lot of time and energy to figure out? Because sometimes it can be fairly obvious,
right? Shaking your head. That's why we're all because people can't see this. I
forget they can't see either. Everyone laughed at me when I said that. But I think in some instances it is fairly obvious because you can't get to this until you've built this, and this, right? But
like you're right. So look, the long-term vision may be fixed, but all that detail below that, absolutely not fixed.
Squiggly lines in between.
Experimentation, all kinds of, user research, all kinds of stuff, and like, honestly, like at least 20-30% of the stuff that we do at Incredible Health fails, right? The experiments, whatever it is. So, and that is weird, but that's our job. If you're an entrepreneur, you're a founder, you're supposed to be innovating, right? So there should be a lot of things that don't work.
What about like, are there things that you were like, okay, we know exactly where we want our differentiators to be, and to build something category defining, you essentially say like, okay, there is no playbook, but like on certain things there are, like you run a two-sided marketplace. Like there are a lot of two-sided marketplaces out there. Like, are there certain things where you're like, we don't need to innovate at all.
100%.
Like, let's use what works.
Yeah, 100%. So for example, the employer side of our business looks like a B2B business, right? We have a direct sales team. There's enterprise marketing that drives leads. Like we don't need to like innovate on how enterprise sales are done, right? Whereas more on the talent side, right? Like which is a very much looks like a consumer company. there's a ton of innovation, and the playbook is not clear on how it is we're going to get every single healthcare worker in the country on our platform eventually, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. There's some stuff that you don't really mess with. Like, I'm not going to mess with the comp plan of a salesperson, okay? Right? But I'm absolutely going to innovate on a software product.
Yeah. And anything with a customer touch point, that makes sense. Because it seems like historically, I don't know about healthcare specifically, but like a lot of enterprise tools, right? That's been the trend, is like you build this thing and it works for the large enterprise side, but it doesn't work for any of the individual users because no one has been concerned about that. They're just concerned about the buyer in the enterprise. And then it's like, do what you will with the users. I don't give a shit. I'm off to the next customer.
Absolutely. And then there's also, Jordan, to your point, like there's key learnings around other two-sided marketplaces. So a key thing when you're building a large two-sided marketplace is you need to stay pretty focused geographically, especially if there's a real life component to your marketplace, which we have that, right? So, when we started the company, we were only in the Bay Area, right? And then we expanded to LA. And now we're in 8 states. We'll be in 13 states by the end of March. We'll be in 30 states by the end of the year. But it's like a very almost regimented way of expanding, because you have to make sure that you have liquidity, like enough supply and enough demand on the marketplace at all times to make sure it's an amazing experience for everyone.
Well, and like the fact that you're like what you're building tells me very much that you're very structured and detail oriented. The way you laid out how you go about fundraising tells me the same thing. And again, your resume says a lot about that as well. Like one of the questions that I like to ask founders and that really fascinates me is like, you have to wear so many hats, right? Like at any given time, you might be like talking to the board, you might be talking to your team, you might be talking to a customer, you might be talking to the sales team. Like, you might be focused on product or financials. Like it's just, you're like split personality almost. And like, how do you organize that? Or is it like what comes, that's what hat I put on? Or do you say like, on Mondays I do this, and on Tuesdays I do this, or in the morning I do this, and in the afternoon I do this? Like, how do you structure that?
Yeah, it's not super, the way I think about it is just keeping in mind that the job of a founder and CEO changes every few months, right? So what I did in our early days is very different. In 2017 is different from what I'm doing, in 2021. And just recognizing that. The other thing tenet that I follow is like ruthless prioritization, right? At any given time, there's probably only 2 or 3 things that I should be doing that is really going to move us forward. Everything else either needs to be done by someone else or is just simply not going to get done. And that list of top 2 or top 3 things changes, month to month or week to week.
But how do you do your opportunity cost analysis and kind of like, how do you spend a lot of time looking back and trying to figure out if that was the right call when you make those prioritization decisions? And I'm asking for personal purposes. I need to do better prioritization.
Yeah, of course. I'm like, I don't get it. We don't get it perfect all the time. And you just have to keep getting better and better at it. But asking yourself the question, right? I ask myself the question, all right, what is the number one problem that we have right now that I need to spend more time on, right? Or what is both important and urgent that needs to get done right away? Right. And so like asking these questions at the beginning of the week, for example, or sometimes even in the beginning of the day, if it's there's a lot of activity happening.
I feel like I can't complain about my day.
No. Well, yeah, no, Jordan started off the call. It was a rough day, I know personally, but also now you're at a place where you're like, never mind, it was fine.
Yeah, totally. Because she's like, here's my life. And I'm like, a Californian complaining about the weather.
Yeah. But Iman, like, I did want to ask about specifically, because you talk about how your job changes every 2 months or whatever, right? And that's like, you often hear that, especially in like high growth companies and tech startups. But has it been specifically in COVID with being a healthcare company, like that must have been multiplied even further, right? Like, how do you deal with that kind of hyper growth in a crisis environment? How do you keep your cool in something like that?
Yeah, really? The pandemic was very impactful on our business. I mean, it accelerated the business, but it also had some pretty big challenges because both sides of our marketplace are deeply impacted by the pandemic. Like, we had nurses who were getting sick from COVID. We had nurses on our platform who actually passed away from COVID. Like 4,000 nurses in the US so far have passed away from COVID, which is awful, right? And then the hospital executives are just, the pandemic is a huge operational challenge, and they're also dealing with employees getting unwell too. So it was, the first thing was just like empathy for all our users, right? And The other thing we did is just like, okay, what can we do to be the most helpful, right? In a crisis like this. And that is why we prioritize things like the pandemic hiring suite for the employers, right? And okay, we have to rapidly shift. They're shifting a lot of their operations because of the pandemic. Like, we need to add things. We need to automate interview scheduling. We need to do remote interviews. We need to get them. The demand for ICU nurses is like massive. Like, critical care nurses is massive. We need to like accelerate that. Like, so we did change the order of some of the things in our roadmap to meet the demand there. And then on the nurse side, so really prioritize anything that helped them with their mental health and their fatigue, right? So, for example, the Incredible Health nurse community, we launched that very rapidly in order for them to be able to support each other. We also have a mental health journal where they're able to track, how they're feeling each day, because that's proven. There's tons of academic research that shows that alleviates fatigue and burnout.
So can I ask, like, as the pandemic strikes and you say, like, okay, here's our roadmap and like, here are all the ways we're going to shift it. Your team, the people building these products and going through the shift as well, are also under an insane amount of stress and like worried about their own. We all were, like, let's just be real. Everybody was. We were all like, hanging by a thread. Like, how do you like lead a team, particularly like you have someone who's working, this is all hypothetical, but you have someone who's working on something for a few months, they're ready to like launch it, or they're about to launch it, or maybe they're a few weeks away and you're like, no, stop, work on this other thing. How do you lead a team through this kind of crisis? How did you like talk to them? How did you get buy-in and like, really make sure that they were like motivated and happy and fulfilled as everything's kind of up in the air and changing so quickly? Yeah,
there are a couple areas that I like had to tackle like right away to help with that. So first is communication. The second is like just there's a couple very many logistical things. On the communication piece is like we increase the frequencies of the one-on-ones, right? We increase the frequency of all hands because like especially, and we also went fully remote, right? So in a situation like that, like we have to over communicate, not under communicate. We shifted to more documentation, like all of these things that helped us be productive during this time. And then the other thing is just the empathy, right? Like I have people on the team employees on the team who, have very young kids at home, right? Or who are in an apartment with a bunch of roommates and it's pretty uncomfortable. And just like acknowledging like, hey, like it's okay. Like this is like, don't worry about like showing up on a Zoom call with your kids around and like it's fine. Like, don't worry about it. Right. So just making sure that people feel comfortable and, like it's not a ding against them or anything, like we're all very understanding here. And then like tactically speaking, from a logistics standpoint, we added a work from home stipend because, people needed to get their nice fancy setups. I mean, I don't think anyone has a setup as good as Daryl's.
No one does. No one on the planet does.
That's not fiscally responsible. You shouldn't allow that at a large enterprise.
Daryl's like, here's my paycheck, B&H.
And like we're very diligent now on like people taking PTO because what ended up happening is people took a lot less vacation, right? During this pandemic. So we're just like big on that as well. So these are just like a few examples of just like managing a team and supporting a team during this crisis.
Yeah, I think this is totally unrelated, but Jordan mentioned it earlier, and I did want to go back to it because I am curious about pricing. Like anytime that the business involves the SaaS component, right? Like I'm curious about how you arrived at pricing and how you decided who pays the product, especially in a double-ended marketplace, and why and when and how you went through all of that.
Yeah, so there was a lot of. So there was a philosophical component to our pricing in that, like, this is always going to be free for nurses. All products will be free for nurses.
All products. Yep. Okay. So there's never going to be a paid for thing from the nurse.
No plans to do that. Wow. And that's a philosophical thing. And just because it just aligns best with our mission of helping healthcare workers live better lives. The other component to it is that honestly, there was a lot of iteration on the business model in the early days. It's in good shape now, but like it wasn't super clear. Should this be subscription? Should this be a consumption-based subscription? Should it be transactions? I don't know. Like there's always like the whole world of business models.
And is it undervalued or overvalued too? Like you don't, even if you can figure out like which mechanism you want to use, you don't like, what's the number? Like it's so hard, right?
Exactly. And I think like a lot of founders have to pay so much attention to your business model, especially in healthcare, like in healthcare, your business model can make or break you. Like we see a lot of very successful healthcare technology companies whose products and services are like, okay, right? But they nail the business model because what matters in healthcare is who pays. And who pays is super convoluted, right? Like, it's not always the patients. Sometimes it's the providers. Sometimes it's the payers. Sometimes it's the employers. It's like super crazy, right? And so, like, if as long as you can figure out how you're going to what the business model is and how you're going to get paid, you nail that. Like, that is an absolute requirement if you're operating in a software company in the healthcare industry.
Wow. Yeah, like X product considerations, X anything else. It's like, just get the pricing right.
And we see the opposite too. We see beautiful products that look amazing and it's an amazing service, but the company doesn't work because this model sucked, right? So
that's funny because I'll share this anecdote. I won't name the company.
That's nice of you. You look like you're still thinking of it.
I'm still thinking about it. I'm like, how much trouble will I get in?
No, I want to protect them.
But I know, no, don't worry about it. It's not a risk for any founders or anything. It's personal risk. But I know of companies where it's like there's not as much sensitivity around pricing there, and they've essentially just taken a pricing model that they put on the web page when they were very young and kept it up the entire time without any kind of like investigation into whether this is the right one, right? Like, it has worked, and perhaps it has worked to great tremendous effect, so there's never been any experimentation around changing it one way or another. But it sounds like for you, that was a necessary ingredient so early on in the process. But like, how did you do your testing? Like, you priced and then go out and then be like, oh, okay, nope.
It was honestly, it wasn't the most methodical of approaches. So
at least it was an approach. That's what I'm saying. Because some places are like,
first you get a lot of advice on it, of course, right? Like from your board members or for other operators, so on. You investigate what the competition is doing. You do chat with your customers about pricing and so on. But what you're really ultimately looking for in business model is customer behavior, right? So we noticed that as we were experimenting with different types of business models, the engagement on the platform would change, right? And does the employer in our case have skin in the game or not, right? And so these are all connected. And then the other thing is, I mentioned earlier about how business model matters a ton when you're operating in the healthcare industry. It's also critical when you're operating a high growth startup, right? Because, if you have strong unit economics, that means you can invest all the profit you make per unit into growth. If you have very strong cash flow, that means you can, and you're collecting upfront, like that cash can be reinvested back into growth, which means you can rely on external capital less, right? So it's such a fundamental part of running a business that when I do see founders that aren't paying attention to it and are like, we'll figure it out later, we're just trying to nail the product. I'm like, no, what are you talking about? It's like so critical.
Well, and it's interesting to talk about like strong unit economics, because I think a lot of people think of price as a lever they can pull for growth. Like, if our price is lower,
right,
we can grow because more people will get it. But like, in reality, you have to think of profit from your unit economics as a way to grow. And you also have to think about like engagement. Like you said, I thought that was an interesting bit where you're like, based on our business model, it's not just like how many new clients we get. It's like the way that our existing clients will behave and whether or not they'll attract the other side of the market.
Exactly. I mean, lower pricing can also lead to lower engagement, right? So.
Yep. Yeah, because people don't feel invested, right? It's like, why do I even have this? Yeah. So what do you think, is it an evolving thing? Like, do you think about pricing continuously, especially as you develop new features and bring new stuff onto the platform?
Always. It's a forever thing. Business model iteration is going to be, it's in pretty good shape now, right? But, I'm sure this is not the final state.
And so like I'm going to nail down that question even more. Like, so it's in good shape now. What does that mean? Like, in a month, are you like, I don't know. Or like, you don't really know, you're going to wait and see until it starts itching again.
The way I have confidence that it's working well now is that employers are very engaged. We have 100%, like, our retention is amazing on the employer side, right? Like, customers don't churn. They're happy with the product. And the deals, new contracts, and as new employers are joining very consistently, right? And in a rapid sales cycle. So that's what indicates that, okay, not just the product, but even the business model is resonating with this group of customers, and they're renewing and they're upselling, and they're using us more and so on. But things shift, right? Like
product development, for example.
Well, even external factors.
Exactly.
Yeah. What about, this is just a future focused question, but what about other areas? Because obviously, other industries have very similar problems with hiring and retention. And like, do you ever envision incredible accountants or anything like that? Or
no, I think we're going to stay on healthcare. I mean, healthcare is just
sounds sexy.
Yeah, like there's $3.3 trillion spent in healthcare every year in the U.S. alone, and half of that, like $1.6 trillion of that is going to the labor in healthcare. And like it's just massive, and I don't think we need to leave healthcare to turn this into a huge business or to achieve our vision and our mission.
Yeah, right. Geez, Daryl.
I wasn't saying.
It's a fair question.
What about other countries? Like, how about Canada here? We have, we could use some help.
True. Eventually, yeah.
Our issue is the economics are so different that usually like there's no incentives, especially in the healthcare space. I talk to a lot of people and they're like, it doesn't work like that way over there. So I don't know. The labor market is probably different, but yeah.
I'm almost afraid of asking this question, but like, how does do you spend a lot of time like thinking about like regulatory changes, especially like considering everything that's happened in the last like 10 years here? Does that make a difference?
Yeah.
Like, I don't.
It doesn't make too much of a difference because regardless of what policies are in place,
it's the labor market.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
not like
at the end of the day, our demand for healthcare keeps going up. Our populations are aging, including Canada, every country, right? Yes. And we just simply do not have enough workers locally, nationally, and globally, honestly. So every country is dealing with a healthcare shortage. So regardless of what your health system is and how it works and the regulations and the policies and who's the president and so on is irrelevant. The demographic changes trump all of that.
Yeah. I bet the investors loved that part where they're just like, oh, a health tech company that we don't have to worry about regulation.
Now, there is some regulation we do have to worry about. We are working with a regulated profession, right? These are licensed.
Right, of course. Yeah, it's not like just like easy peasy.
Yeah, there's some areas we need to remain compliant, but it's not as intense as some of other healthcare companies.
Yeah. And you mentioned like keeping your specialties up to date and stuff Absolutely. Like that, right? And that's stuff you can help with and actually is a benefit to the
and keeping the licenses up to date and so on. Yeah.
I did have another question, but now I'm blanking on it.
My bad. I'll take the blame for that one.
Jordan, it's totally your fault. Or it's because I got distracted by Canada.
Every damn day.
That's all I think about is Canada. It is weirdly what I think about a lot of the time because I work with only American colleagues.
I did want to say something just about the fundraising part made me a little nervous, right? Because there's probably many different people listening to this. Venture capital is not the only way to finance your business. Okay, it's like it is in less than 1% of companies need venture capital, right? And you can.
Well, that actually reminded me what I wanted to ask you about, which was like, how did you make the call that like this is definitely a venture backable business as opposed to like a regular growth curve business or something that we could fund through revenue, right? Because you had revenue basically out the gate.
And you had a technical co-founder. Like, so you like theoretically could build something bare bones and like start with one hospital and like kind of just go.
It all comes down to ambition, right? So I had said, okay, I'm dedicating my 30s to incredible health and then 10 years to incredible health, right? At least. And I want to build something category defining, market leading. And so when you have an ambition like that, raising capital helps. So it all comes down to what you want to do personally with your business. If you're like, okay, I just want to live off my business and that's it, right? Like I'm not trying to transform industries or anything like that. I'm just trying to pay my bills and then no, of course, don't go for venture capital.
Yeah, for sure.
No, that will not work out well for you if you do that in that
Not
case.
only will you not get that funding,
but if you do, it's going to be even worse. Where are my returns? What are you talking about? I just wanted a sandwich.
Just paying Con Ed over here. Chill out.
That's great. Thanks so much. It's great to talk to you. We had a great initial conversation and even more fun second conversation here, and I'm sure we'll have more in the future. I really, really appreciate you sharing all that with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. Very, very excited for this podcast.
So that wraps up our conversation with Iman. It really is, I'm not saying this to be punny, but it's an incredible story about, how she...
An incredible woman.
From an incredible woman. Truly, truly accurate.
Yeah.
While a lot of that stuff has been COVID-19 pandemic specific that she was talking about, a lot of it is going to apply, forever in the healthcare industry. And hopefully they continue to make big changes, because I think the time is now for that.
Found is hosted by myself, TechCrunch senior reporter Becca Skutak, alongside senior reporter Dominic Midori-Davis. Found is produced by Maggie Stamets with editing by Kel. Our illustrator is Bryce Durbin. Found's audience development and social media is managed by Morgan Little, Alyssa Stringer, and Natalie Kreisman. TechCrunch's audio products are managed by Henry Pickavet.